Hey there everyone, Michael A. Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology. And before we dive into today's program, I just want to say a major thank you to all of you who've been supporting my work by purchasing my books, Mastering Traditional Astrology, Horary Astrology and the Natal Promise, and the New Western Medical Astrology. Thank you all so much for supporting the work that we do over here and for supporting me as a self-published author. And if you haven't already purchased my books, please make sure to go over on Amazon and grab yourself copies today so that you can dive into this wonderful world of magical astrology that I've curated for you within these 3 books. And if you've already purchased copies of these books, then please make sure to leave us a review over on Amazon, because that is how Amazon supports me as a self-published author. Once again, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, and do enjoy today's program. Hi there everyone, I'm Michael A. Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and I want to welcome you to our deep dive series on the astrology of Jeffrey Epstein. In this series, we're going to be taking a look at the chart of Jeffrey Epstein from multiple perspectives, particularly from a traditional astrology perspective, because I feel as if for all of us, that's a very important point for us to begin our astrological inquiry. And then we're going to be taking a look at some very cool things going on in Jeffrey Epstein's chart as well, from the perspective of declination, as well as from a cosmobiology perspective and a Uranian astrology perspective. I'm hoping to get through all of it today, and I hope that you enjoy today's broadcast. And once again, as always, if you haven't already subscribed to the Oraculos podcast, please make sure you do so, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify or tuning in from any part of the internet. Please like and subscribe to the Oraculos podcast so that more and more people can be aware of the work that we are doing here. Now, today we are going to dive directly into this chart. Now, I know that a lot of you have heard me say for years upon years that I'm not really that much a fan of celebrity charts. And it's true. I don't really enjoy taking a look at celebrity charts. I feel as if they are a bit lackluster for me, because I particularly enjoy looking at the charts of real people who I have access to, people who I can be in communication with, people who I have the ability to have an ongoing relationship with, so that I can further understand the astrological influences that are unfolding within their lives. However, a wonderful friend of mine, Faith McInerney, who is a Uranian astrologer extraordinaire, does the majority of her astrological research based on celebrity charts, essentially, and she does extraordinary work in that regard. And so recently within one of our classes, the topic of Jeffrey Epstein came up, and I wanted to take a look at this chart just to see whether or not we could, from a bird's eye view, have an understanding of some of the forces and factors at play within this chart. This is something that we did a bit earlier in the year with Charlie Kirk. After Charlie Kirk's assassination, we took a look at Charlie Kirk's untimed birth chart, which I've had a lot of feelings about in the past, and I still have feelings about, because I do think that as astrologers, we should be aspiring to use the most accurate birth information possible. However, once again, I've heard from my colleagues who I trust and love that a lot of the work that we can do as astrologers can be derived from the untimed birth chart. And we definitely saw that to be the case within the chart of Charlie Kirk. And so I was primed and ready to take a look at Jeffrey Epstein's untimed birth chart. But lo and behold, one of our students had his correct time of birth. Now, when it comes to having the correct time of birth for celebrities, I'm always a little bit speculative about it, because there was a moment in my life where I was an astrologer to the rich and the famous. And I know for a fact that a lot of the sources online that we have to access people's birth information is incorrect. One person who I used to be an astrologer for, we went to his Wikipedia page and found that the actual date of birth on his Wikipedia page was completely incorrect when we compared that to the actual date of birth on his birth certificate. So there's a place within me that feels highly speculative of even using Wikipedia as a source from which to draw birth dates. Not even birth times, but birth dates as a thing, because I have seen on one occasion, which is one occasion too many as far as I'm concerned, that you can have an absolute wrong date of birth for somebody on their Wikipedia page as well. However, apparently Jeffrey Epstein birth data is authenticated as being accurate. And so we're going to dive into it. And one of the habits that I've started, particularly since the publishing of my latest book, The New Western Medical Astrology, Pathways Towards the Cosmos and Dwelling, is I've started primarily focusing on the planetary combinations within the chart in general, because I think that focusing on those planetary combinations is always going to be a lot more fulfilling, at least as far as I'm concerned, than really diving into some of the specificities of this planet is the ruler of this house, therefore. So today I am going to do that traditional treatment just because I think that it's important, and I feel as if there's still a place within our practice where this idea of rulers of houses in houses is still something quite significant. But after that, I'm going to take a look at those planetary combinations within this chart that correspond most specifically with the manifestation of concrete events. So without further ado, let us dive into today's episode. Do enjoy. So here we have the chart for Jeffrey Epstein, and his date of birth is January 20th, 1953, and allegedly, he was born at 6:15 a.m. EST in Brooklyn, New York. And his ascendant degree is 12 degrees Capricorn, 3 minutes. For those of you who don't know, I use Regiomontanus houses, not because I think that Regiomontanus houses represent the greatest house system in the world, but because Regiomontanus houses corresponds with the period of astrology in which a lot of my own natal astrological practice is rooted, which is essentially the Renaissance. Now, with 12 degrees of Capricorn, 3 minutes rising within this chart, that tells us that Jeffrey Epstein is fundamentally coming into this world to be Saturnian. And that is because, from a traditional astrological perspective, Saturn is the domicile ruler of Capricorn. There was a time within my astrological teaching when I would go to great lengths to speak about the element of the sign on the cusp of the ascendant, the quadruplicity of the sign on the cusp of the ascendant, the gender of the sign on the cusp of the ascendant, and then speak about the ruler. But I find that it is a lot more useful for me to specifically go to the ruler of the sign on the cusp of the ascendant to give us pretty much all we need to know as far as the baseline of what that person is coming into this world with. So as we assess this Saturn, we're going to be doing it from that perspective. What is the baseline of who this human being is, one, and also how does that baseline inform us about what his primary motivation is going to be like in this lifetime? So as a Saturnian native, in general, this is saying to us that this person is somebody who comes into the world to be responsible. And possibly a part of his responsibility fascination, or his responsibility kink, as it were, is that he found himself born into a world where he didn't necessarily feel as if he had the same type or the same quality of support as other people around him. And so feeling as if he was born into a world where he was unaided and unsupported, and thus thrusted into a role of having to be responsible for not only himself, but also probably of others around him at the same time, that may have caused him to have to mature far quicker than other children around him did, and possibly to mature far quicker than he would have wanted to had he been left to his own devices. Now, when a person is Saturnian, this can say to us that for the most part, within their early life, they are left to their own devices because they have to figure out how to navigate this life as a mature adult, even while they're still very much within their childhood. So this could be something that Jeffrey Epstein found himself having to navigate at a very early age. Now, there's something significant about the domiciles of Saturn, the domiciles of Saturn being Capricorn as well as Aquarius. Dr. William Davidson, who was a medical astrologer who practiced in the 1950s, once commented on the fact that when a person is having Capricorn rising or even Sun in Capricorn, and I'm less a believer of his theories about Sun and Capricorn than I am about his theories about the Capricorn rising. But he said that when a person has Capricorn rising, essentially, it causes them to have less available access to universal life force energy, basically, which was one of his statement for justifying why, in his own words, the Capricorn child looks more sickly in the hospital when they're born than the other children around them. And this is something from a medical astrology perspective that sometimes does hold some level of merit. That of Saturn's two domiciles, Capricorn and Aquarius, the person with the Capricorn rising is oftentimes the person who has to struggle that much more within their youth, even more so than other people around them. And that could be a very specific part of their own identity or their own story growing up, that, hey, I recall my childhood as being a time of very potent struggle, whereas everybody else was having fun and playing with their fish price and their toys and everything. I specifically recall that my childhood was one that was more difficult, either because from a physical perspective, my body was just not physiologically as well equipped for the world as other children around me, or because the circumstances in my life made it so. So this is something that we find with the Capricorn rising as an anecdotal piece to furthermore consolidating and corroborating our idea that perhaps his childhood was one that was fraught with difficulty, or one where he, like the mountain goat in Capricorn, felt as if he had to climb up the steep edge of the mountain from the day that he was born, because he was born at the base of a mountain and he was told to climb, essentially. So that's what we have with this from a general perspective. Now, negatively, this can manifest as a person who is very much always pessimistic, or a person who does not have the most positive outlook on life in general, because whereas other people can see the parade that's going on, he's the person who's going to see the rain cloud. And as a result of seeing the rain cloud within himself, that, hey, there really isn't anything for us to be celebrating truly, or hey, there really isn't anything for us to be getting too carried away with or carried away for, because the reality is there are potholes in the road of this parade and everybody's going to crash and die, essentially. Therefore, we really shouldn't be leaning into this as if it's going to be the best day ever, because I checked the weather forecast and it's definitely going to rain for at least 5 hours of this 6-hour-long parade. So that could be his orientation in life in general. And on the one hand, people might see that and say, oh my goodness, Jeffrey is such a pessimistic person. But on the other hand, for him within himself, he may feel like he's just keeping it real, or he's just essentially trying to make everybody around him aware of the potential pitfalls or the potential potholes that exist within the things that they're trying to do. Now, as I say this, I can feel myself taking on a level of interpreting Jeffrey Epstein's chart as if he were a normal human being. And we know for a fact that this person is a criminal mastermind at that. However, what I think oftentimes happens within these sorts of delineations is we become so quick to jump into a state of judgment about a person, which fine, he's a person who needs to be judged and who should be judged according to the level of his crimes. But we forget that there's a place where if we step back and just look at a person's chart, we would read that person's chart in the same way we would read the chart of any other client. So I'm reading his chart not from the perspective of this person is criminal, but I'm reading this chart from the perspective of if this chart were placed in the front of me in a blind chart reading, or if this chart were placed in the front of me for any reason whatsoever, how would I approach this chart of this unknown person? I think that that's a very important place for us to root our astrological practice for the most part, because we're told by Nicholas Culpeper in the 17th century that an astrologer augments their error based on their level of love or hatred, because we tune down things that we should say when we read the charts of people we love, and we overly emphasize things that could be said negatively when we look at the charts of people who we hate. So today's broadcast isn't necessarily about looking at this chart from the perspective of love or hatred. It's from the perspective of looking at this chart as being a story of the life of a person and potentially using that to see why is it this person ended up in the set of circumstances that he ended up in. So I hope that that's something that you all could appreciate. And I hope that if you were expecting some salacious soundbite, maybe you get it. I'm not sure you will. So This is the first thing that we see about this person being a Saturnian person in general. Now, whenever I speak about the ruler of somebody's ascendant, I always start by talking about the general, and then I do the negative, which we would have just done. And then from there, I do the positive. So what is the positive of him being a Saturnian person? The positive is that as a result of him having this understanding of life and this understanding of the world around him from a more practical and a more pragmatic perspective, this can be one of the things that causes him to indeed be somebody who is elevated to positions of leadership, elevated to roles of authority, elevated to places where he is responsible for the operations and the affairs of many people around him, elevated to a place of high management. Because what may have manifested as a plague for him within youth, i.e., I have to do everything by myself, I have to take care of myself, there's nobody here to support me, nobody loves me, nobody cares about my personal affairs. What may have manifested for him as a plague within his youth, in his adult life, could manifest as a superpower for him in terms of his professional endeavors within the world at large. So that is how I would treat this Saturn from the perspective of speaking generally about the Saturn, then speaking negatively about the Saturn, then speaking positively about that same Saturn. Now, from a natal astrological perspective, after I take a look at the general, the negative, and the positive of the rule of the ascendant, the next thing I do is I take a look at the house location of the ruler of the ascendant. And within this chart, we have the ruler of the ascendant at 27 degrees Libra, 4 minutes, in the 9th house of foreign travel and higher education. And so what this says to us on the one hand is that Jeffrey Epstein could have been a person who, from the day he was born, he wanted to travel. Or from the day he was born with a suitcase in his hands because he wanted to get away from the realities of whatever his local environment was or whatever his local story was. Now, whenever we say anything definitively about a person like that, i.e., from the day this person is born, they want to travel, we cannot just stop there. A lot of times when astrologers delineate charts, for them, it is sufficient to stop there without going further. However, it is important that when you say any definitive statement astrologically, you follow that statement up with the question, why? Why are we saying that from the day he was born, he wanted to travel? What was it within him or within his early childhood environment that may have prompted him to desiring that sort of life, or that may have prompted him to desiring that sort of expansion of his local horizon for him to go out and be in the world at large? What might have been happening within the home that made this person so gung-ho on not being within it? Are some of the questions that I would ask within my mind. And those questions naturally lead me down a path of more richer delineation. But in general, that's the first thing that we see with having the Saturn present within the 9th house. Now, another thing, and let me take that back, not from having Saturn present within the 9th house, but from having the ruler of the ascendant present within the 9th house. As astrologers, we need to distinguish between what it means to have the ruler of a house present in a house versus what it means to have a planet present in a house. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, when I'm viewing Jeffrey Epstein as being in his own 9th house, I'm viewing the ruler of the ascendant, i.e., not Saturn, but L1, as being present in the 9th house. What does L1 mean? L1 means Lord of the first house. So I'm viewing the Lord of the first house being present in the 9th house, devoid of any Saturnian relationship, devoid of any Saturnian coloration. Yes, that is still Saturn, but from this perspective, at this level of interpretation, I have to look at that Saturn not as Saturn, but as L1. Because the definition of anybody having L1 in the 9th house is that I want to travel, I want to see the world at large, I want to be an eternal student, I want to commit myself to a life of learning, I want to uncover all of the mysteries of life. That is what it means for anybody to have L1 in the 9th house. That is a standalone statement by itself. Now, when I remove this filter of L1 and I start looking at that Saturn as Saturn, we will find that to have Saturn in the ninth house means something completely different than to have L1 in the ninth house. All of this has been completely outlined in my book, The New Western Medical Astrology. And the part of why it's outlined in this specific book is because within this book, we deal with how to begin reading a natal chart, which medical astrology is the basis from which we begin reading any natal chart, because we begin reading natal charts from the first house. And the first house isn't just the house of your personality, but it's also the house of your physical body. So yes, in this book, we speak about the delineation of a person's personality, in which I outline this difference between having L1 in a house versus having or viewing that planet through its planetary nature in that same house. We speak about that here, but we also speak about the ways how that physiologically impacts a person. So let's dive back into his chart, and let's now speak about what it means for him to have Saturn in the ninth house, because that's also going to be important. One of the things the ancients tell us about having Saturn in the ninth house is that having Saturn in the ninth house could be one of the indications that a person is going to be an atheist. Now, within the 21st century, our definition of atheism might be a little bit different or a little less charged than the ancients' definition of an atheist, because for the ancients, to be an atheist was one of the worst things in the world, whereas today, atheism is in vogue, and it's cool, and it's fashionable, and we don't hold the same level of existential angst when we hear somebody say they're an atheist. Unless, of course, you're from the Caribbean, which, as we know, hold a lot of existential angst around atheism, because people from the Caribbean have nightmares that their children are going to grow up and be atheists. So that's another thing entirely. But having Saturn in the ninth house traditionally has been one of the indications that the person may grow to be an atheist. And I don't know anything about the religiosity of Jeffrey Epstein other than the fact that he was ethnically Jewish. However, in general, this is one of the indications that a person may struggle with finding some broader spiritual perspective, or a person may struggle with actually believing in any sort of broader spiritual perspective at all, because one of the impacts of Saturn is to bring us back down to Earth. The glyph of Saturn is meant to represent the Earth element surmounting the crescent of spirit. And therefore, in a world where we have the Earth element surmounting the crescent of spirit, there is this internal sense that Earth is all there is. And spirit, if it is anything at all, it is only meant to feed my relationship to this Earth in which I live. Ultimately, this material universe is all there is, and there really is no spiritual depth within that. Versus the glyph of Jupiter, which is meant to indicate to us that spirit should be the entry point by which we interact with the Earth. So Jupiter and Saturn have these two different relationships to the spiritual and the material worlds. Jupiter's relationship is that the spiritual world is meant to inform how we interact with this material world, whereas Saturn's relationship to this concept is that the material world is meant to rise above these amorphous and these speculative ideas that we have about spirituality, because ultimately the material world is all there is, and the material world is all that we can actually justify. So that's Saturn's orientation in general. Hey there, everyone. If you love the sort of astrology that you see here on the Oraculos podcast, and you want to practice astrology in this same way, right now you can purchase our medical astrology preliminary and advanced courses from oraculosastrology.com so that you can practice astrology like an Oraculos trained astrologer. In these courses, I teach you everything that I know about medical astrology so that you can begin practicing not only medical astrology, but also so that you can take your first steps in practicing natal astrology just as if you were trained directly by me. So if this is something that you want to do and you're looking to amplify your astrological tools and skills and practice astrology in a more concrete event-based way, then by all means check out oraculosastrology.com and purchase yourself lifetime access to our medical astrology preliminary and advanced courses today. Now, another thing which is interesting about having the ruler of the ascendant, so once again, I'm switching gears and now going back to having the ruler of the ascendant in the ninth house. Another thing that's interesting about having the rule of the ascendant in the ninth house, and this is something that we learned from Julius Firmicus Maternus, is that when the native has the ruler of the ascendant in the ninth house, that can be one of the indications that the native is going to be the advisor of kings. This is one of our classical understandings of having this planet that is ruling the ascendant in the ninth house, that the native is going to be the advisor of kings. And he really meant this from more of the perspective that the native is going to be the king's astrologer, or the native is going to be the king's prophet, or the native is going to be the king's confidant. But what he's saying to us is that this can indicate that the person is going to be in the shadow of the king, advising the king as to the king's policies and as to the king's decisions. And while we do not necessarily know if Jeffrey Epstein was indeed the advisor of kings, we know that Jeffrey Epstein held himself in the company of kings, in the company of politicians, in the company of the leaders of the world, and his official business title was that he was a consultant. Consultant of what? The world may never know. But his official business title was that he was a consultant. So this idea tracks with this larger traditional astrological understanding that the person with the ruler of the ascendant in the ninth house is likely to be the advisor to kings. Now, after we've done this treatment of the rule of the ascendant, its general significations, its negative significations, and its positive significations, and we've also done a treatment of the rule of the ascendant based on the house in which we find it, the next thing that we do is we look at the aspects to the ruler of the ascendant. Now, the first thing that we see is that Saturn is in a conjunction with Neptune. As all of us should know, the conjunction is not an aspect. Traditionally speaking, there are only 4 aspects: the sextile, the square, the trine, and the opposition. A conjunction is not an aspect at all in traditional astrology. A conjunction is the most important planetary something that can happen between 2 planets, but what a conjunction is not is an aspect. A conjunction is not an aspect. A hatchet, which I thought was buried in the year 2020 when this whole topic of conjunctions came up on Twitter because we had nothing else to do. But a conjunction is most definitely not an aspect, which I do oftentimes find myself continuing to have to say. It is the most important planetary coming together, but it's not an aspect. All the same, we see him having his Saturn, the ruler of his ascendant, in a conjunction with Neptune. When we're looking at a planet through the lens of that planet being L1, the ruler of the ascendant, then we strip that planet of its universal significations. So I'm not looking at this as Saturn conjunct Neptune, even though that does hold valid information, which we do need to speak about. But I'm not looking at this as Saturn conjunct Neptune. I'm looking at this as L1 conjunct Neptune, because at that point, L1 simply becomes a blank canvas upon which we throw the planetary colorations of the planets with whom L1 finds itself in aspect. So here we have the blank canvas of L1, the soul and psyche of Jeffrey Epstein, in an exact conjunction with Neptune. What does that mean? When we have L1 conjunct Neptune, one of the things it can say to us on a physical level is that this could be one of the things that makes us feel more vulnerable within the world at large. It could also be something that makes us feel as if we're born into this world without a fundamental level of protection, which means that we find ourselves feeling more at risk or more susceptible to things going on, or more susceptible to be taken advantage of, because we don't have the same sort of grit about us, or we don't have the same fundamental levels of protection around us and about us from an early age. So we come into this world with this very deep sense of vulnerability, and that permeates our understanding of ourselves within that world. Another thing with the Neptune, especially having L1 conjunct Neptune, is it infuses us with a very real level of naivety, and particularly when we are younger. And the developmental arc of Neptune is that in our youth, we find ourselves very naive, and in our old age, we find ourselves very disillusioned, because the Neptunian youth sees the world and just thinks that everything's going to be okay, thinks that everybody is the perfect sort of person. It sees the world through this universal lens, and as the world continues to show it or show him that it really isn't that way, then he starts to become more disappointed and more disappointed and more disappointed. And that disappointment turns into disillusionment. And that disillusionment fundamentally turns into a deep distrust of the world and everyone and everything within it. So very often when a person has the rule of the ascendant in a conjunction with Neptune, it creates this sense or this arc of going from innocent to slowly finding myself turning into somebody who is completely turned off by the world, to the point where I find myself wanting to escape this world altogether. And the ways in which the Neptunian person can escape the world could be surely through religion and religiosity, but it could also be through narcotics, through drugs, or through any sort of addictive tendency or any sort of addictive behavior. So this L1 conjunct Neptune could be the root of a problem within his life that's saying that as a result of his disillusionment in society in general, he may turn toward a level of addictive patterns or addictive tendencies or addictive behaviors that fundamentally are out of harmony with society. But the reality is he didn't believe in that society to begin with. Therefore, him turning towards those negative or those addictive patterns and things to disassociate himself from the world at large is for him not seeming as if it's wrong in any way, but for him it's seeming like a survival mechanism or a coping mechanism in a world that he really could care less about. So that is what the Neptune is indicating by itself. Now, as we continue to look around this chart at other aspects that he has, we also see that he has Mercury in a Dexter square relationship with that Saturn. And we know that it's a Dexter square because Mercury is in front of Saturn in the zodiac. And therefore, for Mercury to aspect that Saturn, he would have to cast his rays backward. So Mercury is in a Dexter square with that Saturn. And the Mercury square Saturn is one of the things that we oftentimes find within the charts of people who, once again, have this deep sense of pessimism in relationship to how they view and think about the world at large. They do not see the world as being a place that is going to give it the things that they desire or give them the sort of support that they desire. And therefore, as a result of that, there's this deep sense of pessimism or lack of optimism or lack of viewing the world through a positive lens is what we see with the Mercury Saturn. Once again, this makes him a very pragmatic thinker. But a part of his pragmatic thinking could also be the fact that for him, there is no world to consider. There is no moral to consider. There is no social good to consider. And therefore, it doesn't matter what I do because this world is still going to hell in a jet ski in any event. Now, Mercury Saturn in a square relationship could be one thing that says to us that this native has depression, or that depression is something that he may have struggled with early within his life as well. And that's something that could be very true. If we view Mercury based on Mercury being the ruler of his sixth house, which it very well is within this chart, this could also be an indication that he is somebody who is a high stress person in general because he has the ruler of the sixth house rising. But it can also be something that says to us that his health in general is always a major consideration for him because his health and his physical body and the body that he was born into may not be doing what it should be doing, and therefore illness, physical illness may be something that he deals with on a relatively consistent basis via the Mercury, ruler of the sixth house, being in a square relationship with the ruler of the first house. Now, I don't know anything about Jeffrey's health or anything, and if you have any insights into his health, please let us know down below in the comment section for sure. But what we're starting to see is the image of a person who is unaided, unsupported, possibly feeling very undesirable. What we're seeing is the image of a person who wanted to leave his household as soon as he possibly could because that household did not feel like a place that could support him. What we're seeing is the makeup of a person who probably started off life very innocent and then from one thing to the next thing to the next thing found himself moving deeper into a state of disappointment and disillusionment until all of the things that he desired or thought that he loved turned into ashes in his mouth. What we're seeing is a person who, by virtue of his life circumstances, cannot help but to be depressed, cannot help but to be sad, cannot help but to be pessimistic, and cannot help but to believe that the sun will truly not come out tomorrow. And so as a result of all of these things, we then begin to ask ourselves, if this person has this sort of orientation to life, what for him is worth living for in the first place? If none of the things that we see within this material world really make sense to him, what is his purpose for being, essentially? Now, when the person is having this sort of relationship between Saturn and Neptune within their chart, stepping away from Saturn as the ruler of the ascendant and just viewing Saturn in general as Saturn, a planet. When a person is having this sort of Saturn and Neptune combination within their charts in general, this can be a very difficult thing for them to live with. And I think it's quite significant that this releasing of the Epstein files is happening during the time of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, when we find that within his own chart, he was born under the auspices of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So I think it's rather uncanny that all of this should be coming full circle and all of these details should be coming to light under the auspices of this current astrological transit. Now, we might say that Saturn is a very slow-moving planet, and therefore the things that are occurring to Saturn cannot be thought of as having a very permanent or damning effect within our lives. However, it is often the case that we've found astrologically that when a person has a heavily afflicted Saturn within their birth chart, and what can Saturn be afflicted by? Saturn can be afflicted by Mars, because insofar as Mars is a malefic planet, Saturn can be afflicted by Mars, and Mars can also be afflicted by Saturn. Mars is the only faster moving planet that Saturn can be afflicted by. Venus can't afflict Saturn, Mercury can't afflict Saturn, Moon can't afflict Saturn, Jupiter can't afflict Saturn. Sure, we might say that the Sun can afflict Saturn by a conjunction because we know that any planet that's combust is afflicted. But in general, in terms of speaking about an affliction to the nature of Saturn himself, faster moving planets typically cannot, with the exception of Mars, because Mars is mutually a malefic. However, when we're looking for planets to afflict Saturn, we're going to look towards the modern malefics, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And when a person has a heavily afflicted Saturn within their chart, especially if that Saturn is very angular, but also especially if that affliction is very tight, it can oftentimes manifest as that person being rudderless within this lifetime, or not having a strong sense of their own anchoring within this lifetime, or feeling as if they're alive within the world without a sense of direction or a center of gravity. And so when we see him with his Saturn in the conjunction of Neptune, this is actually one of the most challenging afflictions to Saturn that we can ever possibly hope to find. And in my book, The New Western Medical Astrology, I write about this combination, and I also write about every single planetary pair that exists, because the planetary pairs are the basis for both medical astrology as well as for natal astrological delineation. So in my book, I write about Saturn-Neptune as the conjunction, and I say that all of the afflictions of the modern planets to Saturn tend to be negative. After all, the three modern planets are all considered to be malefics within neoclassical astrology, and Saturn is the traditional author of malevolence. Thus, combinations of Saturn with Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto are akin to adding one negative to another. Of these three malefic combinations, however, Saturn-Neptune is the worst. Saturn represents the establishment of all that is concrete and reliable within the world. Saturn is meant to create a container of safety within which we are all supposed to thrive, especially within the earlier years of our lives. Neptune, on the other hand, represents principles of erosion, dissolution, and decay. Everything that Saturn tries to create, Neptune slowly erodes until it is no more. When a person has Saturn-Neptune within their birth chart, they may feel as if they have no solid foundation within this lifetime. They may find themselves moving from one activity to another without a sense of direction or a center of gravity. It is difficult for them to truly grasp a sense of stability within this lifetime because they have been disappointed by the structures of the world so often that they are likely to be deeply distrustful. He doesn't just have Saturn-Neptune, he has Saturn representing him in this lifetime via Saturn being the ruler of his ascendant. Therefore, anything that we might say about Saturn-Neptune in general, for a person who just has it floating around in their charts, for him we can say it even more so. So that's the basis of the Saturn-Neptune, and this is essentially the baseline of us understanding him as a person. Now, you might say, well, Michael, why didn't you also look at the fact that he has his Saturn in what would that be? That would be a Dexter sextile with Pluto, a separating Dexter sextile with Pluto. And sure, we can look at that. I'm not much of a soft aspect person, but sure, we can look at that. Having the role of the ascendant in a sextile relationship with Pluto could give this native dexterity. It can give him toughness. It can give him a sense of being able to find his footing, even though in general he may feel lost and confused about life. Whatever he does eventually find his footing in, it's something that he can dig his heels into greatly, and not necessarily because he believes in it, but from a perspective of survival. And so once again, this is another tendency that we're seeing coming up, this idea that if I'm going to root myself in something, I'm going to root myself in it, not because it's something that is true to me, but because I'm doing it as a means of surviving. And I'm doing it because I don't want to die. I don't want to be extinguished. And so many forces in his life up until this point may have been forces that have challenged his very existence. And I'm not even talking about him as an adult. I'm talking about him just as a human being, as a human child living within the world. He may have gone through so much adversity within his life that may have threatened his very existence, that for him as an adult at this point, he may still be hardwired into that survival mechanism. Even with all the wealth in the world, even with all of the disposable resources that he has, he might still be operating based on these fundamental fears that may have existed within him from the day that he was born. Now that we've done our assessment of the ruler of the ascendant, we can now go and take a look at planets within the first house. And we've already said that the Mercury in the first house is ruling the sixth house, which is denoting that for him, possibly his physical health and well-being may have been a big problem within his life, within his childhood. And that could have been something that he struggled with. And beyond that, he might just be a very highly stressed out person in general, both because of his own physiological constitution within this lifetime, but also because he just finds himself always being at the helm of responsibility. Now, we might say that as the procurer of the illegal things and the illegal circumstances that he procured for people, that might not necessarily be responsibility. But the deeper we dig into this man's story and into this man's history, he was responsible for all of it. He was the mastermind. He was the head honcho of all of these things. And illegal as it was still something that was completely falling on his shoulders as that responsibility that he took upon himself and that he gave to himself within this lifetime. So that's the Mercury rising within the chart. We also find that he has the ruler of the 8th house rising within his chart, which is the sun. And having the sun rising is, on the one hand, something that can denote that the native has some disposable amount of vitality, because having the sun rising is one of the things that says to us that this person is going to have a robust constitution within his lifetime, regardless of whatever else is going on with them health-wise. He may still have a very strong recuperative ability that allows him to bounce back, regardless of what's going on for him in general. So that would be seen having the sun rising. But the sun in this chart is also the ruler of the 8th house. The 8th house is surely the house of other people's money, but the 8th house is also a house of fear and anxiety and things that threaten our physical well-being. And so within him, he may have been someone, once again, from a very early age, who was hardwired by fear, by anxiety, by possibly going through constant near-death experiences that challenged his very rights to be here as a human being. And after a while, you go through your first near-death experience, and it's like, okay, that happens to everybody. You go through your second one, your third one, your fourth one. By the time you go through your fifth one, you start to feel as if the universe has a personal vendetta out against you. And so it causes you to be paranoid. It causes you to be fearful. It causes you to be distrustful. And it fundamentally causes you not to feel as if you should be here to begin with. So these are some of the things we see by virtue of these two planets rising within his chart. Now, as we all know, Mercury in the first house is Mercury in his terrestrial house of joy. And the ancients tell us that when a person has a Mercury in the first house, it causes that person to be elegant. It causes that person to be eloquent in terms of their speaking. And it causes that person to be somebody who excels within things having to do with academics, but also things having to do with the use of their voice as a tool by which they gain influence within the world at large. Now, one of the stories that I think is interesting about him is that he is somebody who never finished university or he never finished college, but he ended up getting a job teaching at one of the most prestigious preparatory schools ever. And he was teaching physics or something within the sciences, I think, as somebody who did not graduate from any higher educational institution. And I think another piece is that if you listen to some of the interviews he gave, and once again, not even interviews from the perspective of after he was found out, but if we listen to interviews he gave about the topic of physics and the reality of human life and interviews regarding his scientific ideas, he was brilliant. He was a genius from the perspective of this idea of a person who speaks and this idea of a person who can be convincing with their words. He was a genius, quite similar to Ted Bundy, who also had the combination of Mercury within his chart in a hard aspect with Pluto. And I know I haven't mentioned Jeffrey Epstein's own Mercury Pluto yet, but he most definitely has Mercury in a quincunx relationship with Pluto, and a very tight one at that. Ted Bundy similarly had Mercury Pluto, and he too was a genius. If we recall, Ted Bundy was somebody who did not want to be represented by any legal team because he wanted to represent himself. And he had so many Americans just oozing and gushing over him because he was such an eloquent, such a convincing speaker. And he also had this deep animal magnetism. And so within Jeffrey Epstein's chart, we find also the combination of Mercury-Pluto. Mercury-Pluto is one of the combinations that we find within the charts of people who could sell oil to an oil salesman, or who could sell, fish to a fisherman, or who could sell water back to the ocean, basically, because Mercury-Pluto has to do with the person who understands that they are the most brilliant person in the room. They understand that their mind is more developed than the minds of other people around them. They understand internally the depth of their own genius. And as a result of that, they know that they can manipulate things to their own end, and they know that they can take advantage of others as well. And so him as a person, this could have been one of his superpowers, negative though it may be, that he used within the context of his life and his interactions and his dealings with others to make not only what he was doing seem convincing, but also to get so many of these influential people around the world to also believe that they would be safe by engaging in those criminal activities with him in the way that he presented it, or probably based on how he presented it. It may not have seemed like there would be repercussions. It may not have seemed as if there would be any damage. It could have been like Lucifer, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, saying to Eve, well, God said that you might die, but there's no actual evidence that you will die. Therefore, why don't you live a little, basically? And I'm not sure that that's exactly what the serpent said to Eve, but essentially that was the case. The serpent asked Eve, hey, what did God say to you? Eve told the serpent what God said, and then the serpent said, well, did he really say it like that? Or was there some undertone within that gives you some level of freedom of choice within this desire to possibly eat this fruit or not? And so this Mercury-Pluto combination is the combination of lawyers and politicians, but it's also the combination of cult leaders. It's also the combinations of hypnotherapists. It's the combination of people who know how to get into your mind and create a reality within your mind. No attack to hypnotherapists. I love hypnotherapy. But it's a combination of people who know how to use their mental powers to get into your mind to make you feel as if their sinister way, or not even sinister, but just that their way of viewing reality is a way in which you too will be protected and you too will benefit from that form of thinking. So this is something that we see through the Mercury-Pluto combination within his chart. Now, I think that it's very appropriate for us to step away from talking about him as a person and now talk about some of the relationships that underpin his life. And that is what we're going to do in part 2 of this series on Jeffrey Epstein. So stay tuned.